Welcome back to Task and Purpose. I'm your average infantryman, Chris Cappy. The Russian BMP Terminator is weird. It's not a tank, and it's not an armored personnel carrier. And yet, it's the world's first tank support vehicle. So what is that really? Well, the Terminator is specifically designed to increase survivability in the only location that tanks are notoriously vulnerable, urban cities. The Terminator's development runs all the way through history, from challenges faced during the Soviet Union in the 1980s all the way to today. When Russia first deployed it to Ukraine, videos of the scary-looking armored vehicles quickly circulated around Russian military blogger Telegram channels, and a lot of hullabaloo was made over how these BMP Terminators were going to turn the tide of the war. They were going to protect these vulnerable Russian tanks in key battles in Ukrainian cities like Severodonetsk. So what happened to it since then? And did it really work as promised? And does its tactics and doctrine really live up to all of this hype? Is it going to travel from the future to take out Sarah Connor? Let's answer these questions and more. But first, today's sponsor is Enlisted, a free World War II multiplayer shooter with a strong focus on historical authenticity for PC and consoles. I love to grab a bolt-action rifle with only iron sights and just knock down enemies one after another in intense combat in this game. Enlisted offers large-scale combat with player-controlled squads and really intricate strategy and depth. You get to play in distinct historical campaigns such as Battle for Moscow and the Invasion of Normandy. It even has cross-platform support. Personally, I was enlisted when I was in the army, so this is right up my alley. They keep gameplay dynamic and you're always in the middle of action. I actually played this game because it ticks all of the boxes for me personally. You can use tons of different playstyles like being a sniper, engineer, command a rifle squad, or even take control of a tank or armored car. This game really gets crazy when there's suddenly tons of different troops on the battlefield at the same time. Play Enlisted for free on PC and the consoles. Just click the link in the description to download the game and get your exclusive bonus of 3 days of premium and several orders of troops and weapons. I'll see you guys on the battlefield. Ever since armored vehicles became a mainstay in land warfare, they've always struggled with one thing, which is fighting in built-up, complex urban terrain. Urban city locations notoriously give infantry an endless amount of places to hide behind and concrete rubble to displace back to safely. Russian ground commanders, with a strategy of throwing armor at problems, have often had to give up the initiative of having this high-speed armored vehicles to ensure their vehicles' safety. They do this by waiting for the support of their lower, slower, dismounted infantry. But what if we could create an armored solution with enough firepower to replace the slow-moving foot soldiers? But Russia, they've already learned all of this the hard way in two very prominent conflicts. There was the 10-year occupation of Afghanistan from 1979 to 1989, and the First Battle of Grozny during the First Chechen War in the 1990s. In both of these conflicts, they learned a very similar lesson that led to the BMPT. In Afghanistan, harsh mountainous terrain led to hundreds of Soviet armored vehicles being destroyed by Mujahideen fighters, who were able to use the elevation in the mountainous terrain to their advantage by firing down on the Russian convoys that were not able to raise their BMPs or BTR weapons high enough. The turret systems couldn't engage them at high elevations. The Soviet vehicles couldn't return fire in many instances. So in the 1980s, the Soviet Union demanded a solution to this huge problem. The Chelyabinsk tractor plant under the direction of V.L. Brzezinski was given the job. The Chelyabinsk tank factory has a historic legacy stretching back to the Soviet Union. It was created as part of Joseph Stalin's first 5-year plan. The plan was meant to transition the Soviet Union from a weak agriculture state to a major industrial power that could pump out thousands of tanks. Total industrial output increased by 118% for the Soviet Union during this first 5-year plan. But the socialist plan of collectivizing agriculture had the side effect of leading to major famine, where 4 million Ukrainians passed away. This is a source of friction between the Ukrainian people and Russia to this very day. The Chelyabinsk plant began work on putting together 3 very bizarre prototypes for the vehicle that would become the BMP Terminator. This included Object 781, Object 782, and Object 787. These early 1980s prototypes showed the beginnings of the concept of an idea, of a notion, of a thought coming together for the BMP Terminator. But the way that it would end and is very stereotypical of how Soviet Union failures happen, and I couldn't have made it up better myself. Every superhero and military vehicle has an origin story. So where did the Terminator come from? Were its parents shot in an alley when it was a kid? Did it get bit by by a radioactive Terminator? So in 1987, the Object 781, the first crack at it, for instance, you had to look at this. It had two 30mm autocannons on separate turrets on top of the vehicle. Each one had its own 7.62mm machine gun on top of it that operated independently of each other, so they could each turn 360 degrees and face their own direction and engage separate targets. The whole genesis of the Terminator concept was a tank that could hypothetically engage 5 different targets at 360 degrees at the same time. The Russian military felt that their tanks at the time were being overwhelmed by too many infantry targets. This solution was unique, insane, both those things, right? It was like some kind of nightmarish two-headed dragon. This is a curse of a tank if I ever saw one. The Object 782, also created in 1987, was equipped with a low-profile two-man turret that had a single 100mm 2A70 gun with a 30mm autocannon attached directly to it. But these vehicles were designed at a strange time in the late 1980s, early 1990s, when the Soviet Union was collapsing. So there was chaos in the country at the time because of this big power vacuum, and definitely no funding for fancy new tanks or infantry fighting vehicles, so they ended up at the Armored Kubinka Museum. At this point, it seems like our hero would never have an origin story until the Second Chechen War renewed interest in the concept of a tank or armored tracked vehicle that could hit multiple targets at the same time. In 1996, the Russians built a prototype for the Object 787, which was closer to the BMP-T that we all know and love today. It had dual 30mm autocannons, but their barrels were on opposite sides of the tank, at least 12 feet apart, and each one had a massive heavy 12.7mm machine gun next to it. It even had unguided rockets on each side, making this thing like the Soviet mammoth tank from Red Alert, if anyone remembers that. It's just nerds like me. High-ranking, influential Russian officers supported this Object 787. I mean, they were gunning hard for this vehicle. You had Colonel General Maev, who's the former Marshal of the Soviet Union, and Army General Zasev. With important people like that, there was nothing that they could do to screw this up, right? There was no way they could piss off the government and get themselves into tremendous trouble. They ran an advertising campaign on the Object 787 on national television that rubbed the Russian government, let's say, the wrong way. An investigation accused the commercial of publishing Russian military secrets. They went from the cool kids to potential state enemies. It would be like if the Department of Defense threw me in jail for releasing information about a new US Army tank. This controversy completely ended the development of the Object 787, and even worse than that, it led to major high-level personnel changes at the Chelyabinsk tractor plant. You'd think that would be the end of the concept for the Terminator, but it just refused to go to bed. It popped back up in 1991 as the Object 199, with designers from famed Russian tank building plant Earl Vagonzavad working on what would become the BMP Terminator. The ingredients stayed largely the same in the tank, except the recipe changed slightly, with the cannons being moved closer in towards each other. Finally, this version was shown to the public in 2002, and it would go into production in 2011. So why did the Russian military stay so preoccupied with this concept for a high firepower, high elevation vehicle that could hit multiple targets at the same time? Which are things you might have to give up if you decided to dismount your slower moving infantry foot soldiers in order to protect your armor. So Russia wanted to keep their warfighting strategies the same. If they could get it to work as this tank support vehicle concept, it would give them the direct fire support necessary to continue a warfighting strategy built around armor. During the First Chechen War in 1996, Russia famously lost an entire armored brigade in urban fighting due to the hit-and-run nature of Chechen fighters that took advantage of unsupported armor with poor situational awareness. This is why armor must always be supported by infantry, even though it sucks to get out of the back of an armored vehicle and walk around on foot. I'm actually pretty sure it's one of the 10 commandments, thou shalt not have armor without thou infantry support. But what if we could break the tank god rules and start our own tank cult? The BMPT was designed to do exactly that, and after the First Chechen War, Russia poured more resources into its development. It was meant to break the sacred rules of needing infantry to support tanks. Blasphemy, I know. The BMPT concept is based on having the combined firepower of 2 infantry squads with the maneuverability and protection of a tank. But there was a problem with this new production model BMP Terminator. Russia never fully integrated the idea into their entire force structure. There were no guidelines for how many Terminators should accompany each tank formation. There were no strategy given out on how to deploy them or what their main mission should be. This hinted at the idea that its performance and the concept of it as a tank support vehicle might still be questionable even to the Russian military, who might only be interested in exporting and selling these to foreign militaries. So on May 18, 2022, Russia's RIA Novosti news agency confirmed the deployment of a company of Terminator tanks alongside a few T-72 tanks in the Luhansk Oblast in eastern Ukraine. The Terminator saw its first combat during the fighting in the Donbas region, specifically in the city of Severodonetsk, where from May to June of 2022, the war saw some of the most brutal urban warfare in the entire conflict. It seems like the best time and place for Russia to use this wonder weapon, right? After Russia struggled to fully gain an advantage in the area, the decision was made to deploy the only operational company of BMPTs in their military. So what happened to the company of Terminators that deployed into eastern Ukraine? Well, Oryxy, who tracks vehicle losses, does not officially track any of the Terminators destroyed in the war. There are, however, some unofficial rumors floating around, and I don't know about you, but I'm not above a little bit of juicy gossip every now and again. According to this Reddit post asking what happened to the Terminator, the top comment says that the first time that they brought this into combat, it took artillery fire and was never seen again. Another commenter said one was destroyed by artillery, two were heavily damaged, so they decided to remove them from the front to not lose them. Also, high-ranking Russians in the army said they were shitty and didn't perform at all, so it was useless to them on the active front. And these claims are backed up by some photographic evidence and news reports from the front lines. This article showed images of the BMPT taking artillery fire from Ukraine alongside its T-72s that it's supposed to be protecting. The Terminators were apparently bunched up in formation close to the tanks, being the kind of target an artilleryman dreams of. The Terminators retreated because they were unable to accurately engage the enemy at artillery range. Ukraine claims to have damaged 3 Terminators in that engagement and destroyed 1. So 4 out of the 10 deployed are probably knocked out of the fight already. Because the Terminators were created in so few numbers and not integrated into the battle until about 2 weeks into the fighting, commanders didn't know how to effectively use them. The fighting continued for another 4 weeks after the vehicles were deployed. It wasn't until Russia surrounded the city with conventional units and used relentless artillery strikes that the battle went in their favor. Since then, their presence has been noticeably absent. Some sources cite that even Russian officers were complaining that it performed poorly and was just another target for Ukrainian fire. The theory is that in practice, the Terminators turned out to be too heavy for it even with its supercharged engine, with all the weapon systems, and less mobile than tanks that are meant to be protected. The Russian military was forced to pull these vehicles to their rear formations. There's another major problem with the Terminator, which is the amount in existence. Why is this an issue? Commanders were simply handed 1 or 2 of the platform and told, yeah, I don't know, man, just figure something out. While it's not clear how many Terminators the Russians actually have, making final numbers deployed hard to nail down, estimates by different analysis reports only about 10 or so are operationally integrated into Russian ranks as part of the Russian 9th Tank Division under Colonel Ramil Ibitulin. Only 10 were initially delivered to the Russian Ministry of Defense in 2018 and only officially became operational in 2021. The BMPT suffers from the fact that it's a brand new type of vehicle requiring a new way of integrating it into battlefield formations, and because they are so few in number, almost no one has any experience in how to best utilize them. Commanders are likely going to treat them as another basic tank or IFV as opposed to relearning warfare tactics on the fly in the middle of an urban siege. On paper, the Terminator would be divided out in singles or pairs to large formations as support, but all videos from the region show them all moving together as a single unit instead of integrated with tanks. While it's likely they were generally spread around in formations, it does raise some serious questions about how they're actually being used in combat. So the BMP Terminator, I think, was ultimately pulled from the front lines because they wanted to avoid a situation where they had this humiliating defeat where you see the destroyed husks of the BMP Terminator. It would have been a major news story, even if one was blown up, which is why Russia had to pull them back. A press release from the Russian tank building plant said that in terms of its combat effectiveness, one BMP-T will replace 2 BMPs and a motorized rifle platoon. So this is the closest we got to any kind of strategy or doctrine with them, but this never came to be in reality. The results from the combat tests of the BMP Terminator in Syria remain classified, and the fact that it wasn't integrated into a widespread use in its forces suggests that there may have been problems with the unconventional twin cannons and its accuracy. The BMPT, in essence, is a large, unmanned turret slapped onto a T-72 hull. Because the turret is unmanned, it gives the hull extra space for extra ammunition, allowing for 850 rounds of 30mm. There's also space for extra crew and greater gun elevation and depression angles. Unlike the typical Russian tank crew of 3, the Terminator holds a crew of 5. This consists of a commander, driver, gunner, and 2 grenade launcher operators on one of the versions, each manning one of the AG-17D located on the edges of the frontal armor. The dual 30mm 2A42 autocannons, being the primary weapons on the vehicle, have an adjusted rate of fire of between 200 and 800 rounds per minute and a published range of 4,000 meters, though the practical accuracy due to their mounting and side-by-side orientation of the gun barrels is much lower, and it relies on this area explosions caused by HE rounds to do most of the damage. The whole idea behind dual mounting the cannons is that it can suppress a wider area of targets of, say, an entire building with one rip. So the vehicle has a max speed of 60 kilometers per hour over highway and a total range of 550 kilometers when using external fuel tanks. In theory, it was about as maneuverable as the tanks it was designed to protect. On each side of the turret are 2 130mm 9M120 Ataka anti-tank missiles, giving the gunner a total of 4 missile launches before requiring a reload. These rounds are reported to be able to penetrate up to 800mm of homogeneous armor equipped with ERA protection at a range of 5,800 meters. The other added benefit of having these kinds of missiles in urban combat is that they can cut through concrete. All that additional firepower comes at a cost though. When the Terminator is weighed in, its final tally is 48 tons, 7 tons more than your typical T-72 and 2 tons heavier than a T-90. In order to combat this extra weight, most Terminators use a V92S2 engine capable of putting out 1,000 horsepower, giving it a decent power-to-weight ratio. But bigger engines mean more fuel consumption means harder logistics. But what were the 2 main issues that this vehicle faced in urban fights that they need to solve here? The first is situational awareness, and the second is gun elevation and depression. Sights inside of a vehicle like tanks and IFVs, while being able to see very long range, also have a very narrow field of view, almost like looking through a drinking straw at very small portions of your surroundings. While analog periscopes often provide a wider field of view outside the vehicle, anyone who's spent any significant time in a heavy tracked vehicle will tell you that they're often disorienting, hard to see through, and they throw off any depth perception. This is why, when not in active combat, you'll often see crew members out of the hatch in order to actually have a good idea of what's going on around them. But this leaves them completely exposed. If one member of a tank crew goes down, it's sometimes enough to render the whole thing instantly combat ineffective. Add in that the inside of a turret or hull is insanely loud, and you have a recipe for disaster if a tank doesn't have additional infantry supporting to give it better eyes and ears. The B07 K1 Panoramic Site is a special addition to the turret that most tanks do not have. It's an optical sight that can move around 360 degrees so the crew can use thermal imaging to spot enemy locations all around the vehicle, unlike your average T-72. Looking at gun elevation and depression, we're referring to how many degrees the gun on a vehicle is capable of being raised and lowered. Gun elevation limitations are especially a problem in urban or mountainous terrain where verticality is the defining feature of possible targets. All it takes is one guy with a rocket launcher to be on the 3rd floor of a building just a little above the maximum gun elevation to make a tank a sitting duck, unable to return fire. The T-72, for instance, has a gun elevation between -6 and +14 degrees, which is very limited compared to the BMP Terminator that has a greater range of cannon maneuverability with ranges between -5 and +45 degrees. So why is it rarely used? Another possible downside to the Terminator vehicle that stopped it from being more widely used comes from a Shepard Defense Insight, which describes a requirement for 100 BMPT vehicles at an estimated cost of 18.5 billion rubles or 250 million USD, giving a unit cost of about 185 million or more than 3 million USD, which is about twice the cost of a regular BMP. Say what you want about the BMP Terminator, it's a unique vehicle, and the Russian tank designers were pushing the limits here while everyone else was playing safe with their tank design. The most obvious unique aspect of the vehicle is its dual cannon system. It's also a problem for the designers. Embarrassingly enough, reports indicate that the reason for the two separate guns was because they were unable to retrofit a dual feed system seen in most infantry fighting vehicles. So in order to be able to switch to a second ammo type like HE to armor piercing, they decided to just have one gun for each, which is an answer to the problem, but maybe not the answer. Side-by-side mounting reduces the overall accuracy of the firing system, as it has to compensate for the gun barrels not being in the direct line of what they're intended to shoot at. The claim that it can engage 3 targets simultaneously has also been questioned by the Russian Ministry of Defense himself, complaining that they were only able to effectively engage 1 target at a time during trials and training. Finally, the entire turret itself greatly lacks any substantial protection from incoming fire. While the guns of a BMP and T-72 are well protected within the housing of the armored turret, the Terminator turret is exposed. A single NLAW or well-placed RPG shot would be enough to make the vehicle a very expensive armored taxi for its 5 crew. Even a few rounds of armor-piercing rounds from a heavy machine gun could spell disaster for this design. We might see one of the 8 remaining Terminators pop up again in the current war in Ukraine. Where or when is anyone's guess, but it's very unlikely to be a showstopper its supporters were expecting it to be. I'm your average infantryman, Chris Cappy, and until next time, hasta la vista, baby. Wow, I'm cringy. Don't forget to try out Enlisted. It's a completely free-to-play game. Check it out by clicking the link in the description. If you enjoy fast-paced World War II era combat, this game is perfect for you guys.